She left no argument, no broken china, no slammed door. She left one page: I leave Wetherbourne with my dignity. I have given this house my patience, my loyalty, and my heart. But I cannot continue living where I must beg to be seen. And on the mahogany desk, where he had signed 1,000 documents that mattered, she placed her wedding ring. The Duke of Wetherbourne stood in the silence of his own castle and felt, for the first time in 6 years, something he had no name for. If you have ever loved someone who looked straight through you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments. What city are you watching from tonight? The carriage wheels had not yet stopped rolling when Charles Everard Wycliffe, 8th Duke of Wetherbourne, noticed the silence. It was not the silence of an empty road or a sleeping countryside. Yorkshire in late October carried its own particular hush, the fields stripped bare, the sky pressing low and gray against the moors. He had ridden through that silence 100 times without giving it a second thought. This silence was different. This silence had a shape to it. It pressed against the windows of the carriage before he had even stepped out onto the gravel drive. The footman opened the door. Charles descended. He straightened his coat with the automatic precision of a man who had been watched his entire life and had learned to appear composed whether he felt it or not. He looked toward the entrance of Wetherbourne Castle, the great iron-banded doors. The stone archway worn smooth at the edges by 2 centuries of weather. The twin torches already lit against the failing afternoon light. And the doorway was empty. His eyes moved across the entrance once. Then again. The movement was involuntary, barely perceptible. A duke did not scan doorways like a nervous footman, searching for his employer. But his body registered what his mind had not yet permitted itself to name. Eleanor was not there. In 6 years of marriage, she had met him at the door every time he returned from London. Every time. It had not been a formal arrangement. No one had instructed her to do it. It was simply what she did, and he had, without ever examining it, come to expect it, the way he expected the sun to be in a certain place at a certain hour. The small cup of tea waiting in his study, the letters sorted by priority. Her voice in the corridor asking the staff what time he was expected. He had taken all of it as the natural order of a well-managed household. He had never once asked himself who was managing it. Hargreaves was already moving down the steps. The man had served as head butler at Wetherbourne for 19 years, and his face long, careful, and entirely without expression when it needed to be told Charles nothing useful. He carried a silver tray. On the tray sat a single envelope. Your Grace. Hargreaves extended the tray with both hands. Her Grace instructed that this be delivered to you upon your return. Charles looked at the envelope. His name was written on the front in Eleanor's hand, the same slanted, unhurried script she used for household correspondence, for letters to the tenants, for the notes she left him when he missed dinner because Parliament had run long. The handwriting was perfectly steady. That detail registered somewhere beneath his composure and lodged itself like a splinter. He took the envelope. He did not open it in the drive. He carried it through the entrance hall, past the oak paneling, past the portraits of men who had worn his title before him, each face more severe than the last, as though the centuries had gradually pressed all softness out of the Wycliffe line. The fire in the main hall was already burning. Staff moved at a respectful distance. Everything was in its place. Everything was exactly as it always was. Except the house felt wrong in a way he could not locate. He went to his study. He closed the door. He broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded one page, just one, and read, My dear husband, I leave Wetherbourne with my dignity. I have given this house my patience, my loyalty, and my heart. But I cannot continue living where I must beg to be seen. I do not write this in anger. I write it in the sorrow of a woman who tried, for many years, to be enough for a man who never thought to ask if she was all right. Do not mistake my leaving for weakness. This is the first decision I have made entirely for myself in 6 years. I hope one day you understand why that was necessary. Eleanor, he read it a second time, then a third. He was not a man who was often at a loss. He had managed a duchy since the age of 26, had navigated the complexities of Parliament, had buried his mother, had settled disputes between tenants that had festered for generations. He was not a man who stood in his own study not knowing what to do. He stood in his own study not knowing what to do. His first coherent thought, the one that embarrassed him later, when he had more room to be honest with himself, was that there had been some misunderstanding. A letter written in a moment of emotion, perhaps. He would send for Hargreaves. Hargreaves would explain. Eleanor had gone to visit her sister in Hampshire. She had gone to London for a few days without telling him, which was unusual but not impossible. There was an explanation. There was always an explanation. He pressed the letter flat against the desk. He looked at the single page, as though if he studied it long enough, it would reveal a sentence. He had missed something that softened the words, qualified them, made them mean something other than what they said. The words did not change. He left the study. He walked down the corridor to Eleanor's rooms, the set of rooms that connected to his own through the dressing room. As was traditional in houses of this size, he pushed open the door. The room was tidy. That was the first thing he noticed, not empty. Not ransacked, not disordered in any way. The furniture was intact. The curtains drawn against the evening, the fireplace cold. Her vanity table held only the small things that had always sat there: a glass perfume bottle, a silver hairbrush monogrammed with her initials from before their marriage, a small framed portrait of her mother. But the wardrobe stood open. He crossed the room and looked. Half the gowns were gone. The traveling cases that had lived on the upper shelf were gone. Her jewelry case, except for a few pieces he recognized as family heirlooms belonging to the Wycliffe estate, which she had left precisely and deliberately, was gone. She had planned this. She had not fled in a moment of grief or anger. She had packed carefully, taken what was hers and left what was not. Even in leaving, she had been meticulous. Even in leaving, she had been considerate. He turned back toward the vanity table. And then he saw it, the ring. It sat on the polished wood, just beside the perfume bottle, on a small square of folded velvet, as though she had taken care to place it somewhere it would not be lost or knocked to the floor. The gold band caught the weak light from the window. He had placed that ring on her finger on a cold February morning 6 years ago in a church in Hampshire, and she had looked up at him with the kind of feeling a man sometimes only recognizes when it is already in the past. He picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. He stood there for a long time. The question that finally broke through past the confusion, past the reflexive certainty that this was a misunderstanding, past the Duke of Wetherbourne's carefully maintained sense that things in his life happened in logical and manageable progressions, was a very small question. And it alarmed him precisely because he did not have an answer to it. When had he last asked Eleanor how she was? Not how the household was running. Not whether the dinner arrangements for the Harmont visit had been confirmed. Not whether young Thomas was eating properly or had recovered from his cough. When had he last looked at his wife, at Eleanor specifically? Eleanor the person, Eleanor who had sat beside him at this estate for 6 years, and asked her something that was only and entirely about her. He could not find the memory. He searched for it the way you search a room for an object you were certain you had placed somewhere specific. And the searching itself begins to tell you something you did not want to know. He went back to his study. He sat down, and for the first time in a very long time, Charles Wycliffe did not know what the correct next action was. Hargreaves appeared at 8 o'clock with supper on a tray, because it had become clear that His Grace would not be appearing in the dining room. "Where is she?" Charles did not make it a question. His voice was flat, controlled, giving nothing. Hargreaves set the tray down with the careful movements of a man who had learned decades ago that the wisest thing a butler could be in a difficult domestic situation was extraordinarily useful and extraordinarily quiet. "Her Grace departed this morning, Your Grace. Shortly after 9 o'clock. Departed to where?" A precise pause. "Her Grace did not inform the household of her destination. But you know." Another pause, marginally longer. "I was instructed to provide Your Grace with the letter, and to ensure the household continued its regular operations during the period of Her Grace's absence." Beyond that, Hargreaves. Charles looked up from the desk. "I am asking you where my wife has gone." The old man met his gaze with the steady, kind, and completely immovable expression of someone who had made a promise and intended to keep it. "I believe Her Grace has made arrangements of her own." "Your Grace." "Arrangements she did not see fit to share with the household, and which I am therefore not in a position to." She told you. She asked me to receive the letter promptly, and that the household did not fall into disorder. Charles pushed back from the desk. He walked to the window. Outside, the park was completely dark now. The old oaks invisible against the sky. Only the faintest suggestion of the path down to the lake catching the light from the house. He had walked that path with Eleanor once, early in their marriage, when they had stayed up talking past midnight and gone out into the summer dark because neither of them had wanted the conversation to end. He could not right now recall what they had talked about. She is at her sister's in Hampshire, he said, more to the window than to Hargreaves. She will have time to reflect. She is a sensible woman. She will have time to— Yes, Your Grace. The butler's agreement was too careful and too prompt. Charles heard it. You don't believe that? Hargreaves did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was measured and quiet. I believe Her Grace to be a woman of considerable resolve. Your Grace, I have observed as much over the past 6 years. She will come back. I have no doubt that Her Grace will do exactly what she determines is best. A pause. Shall I have Mrs. Pemberton keep supper warm or leave it? The door closed. Charles stood at the window for a long time. He ate nothing that night. He slept poorly, waking before dawn to a bedroom that felt wrong in a way he kept trying to define and couldn't. The house was too quiet, but it was always quiet. Wasn't it? The staff were as attentive as ever. The fires were lit. The water brought, schedule of the day laid out in the study as it always was. And yet something kept pulling his attention sideways, like a sound he could not locate. By the second morning, he had decided he would send a letter to her sister's house in Hampshire. Just a brief note, formal, appropriate, not a demand. He was not the sort of man who made demands of his wife in writing. Simply an inquiry, a request that she return at her earliest convenience so that they might discuss, in a rational manner, whatever concerns had led her to this decision. He sat down to write it and found that the usual language would not come. He knew how to write formal correspondence. He knew how to write to Parliament, to his solicitors, to his estate managers, to the men who handled the coal concern in the north. He did not know how to write to his wife, or rather, he realized, with a feeling like stepping off the bottom stair and finding nothing beneath it. He had not written to her in years. There had been no need. She was always there. You did not write letters to someone who was always there. Except she had not always been there. She had been there in his house, in his household, in his rooms, but she had needed something from him. Evidently, that he had never thought to examine, and she had waited for it long enough that she had stopped waiting. He did not finish the letter. He left it on the desk. At noon, he had Hargreaves bring him the household account books. He did not know precisely why, some instinct toward information, toward understanding the scope of what had changed. He had looked at these books before, of course. He was responsible for the estate and reviewed them quarterly with his secretary. But now he looked at them differently. He looked at the entries he had always skimmed past the household expenses, the charitable disbursements, the record of payments made, aid to tradesmen and suppliers, and the families in the village who had, from time to time, needed assistance. He saw the patterns Eleanor had established, the careful distributions, the quarterly gifts of coal to the oldest tenant families during winter, the arrangement with the doctor in the village whose bill for services to estate workers was quietly settled each month. None of this had required his instruction. None of it had been brought to him for approval. It had simply happened, the way a heartbeat simply happened. And he had attributed it to the household running well, without ever asking himself who was running it. There was a note in the margin of one entry, in Eleanor's handwriting. Tom Fletcher roof damage from October storm. Arranged temporary repairs from estate fund. Charles should visit when possible, family anxious. He had never visited Tom Fletcher. He did not know who Tom Fletcher was. That afternoon he put on his coat and walked the south field to the row of tenant cottages at the far edge of the estate. The wind was sharp and smelled of coming rain. A woman came to the door of the third cottage, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with the weather-worn competence of someone who worked hard and expected nothing to be given. She looked at him with the wariness that tenants generally extended to unexpected ducal visits. Mrs. Fletcher, Your Grace. She dropped a quick curtsy. This is we weren't expecting. I understand you had storm damage to the roof. She stared at him for a moment, and something complicated passed across her face, surprise. And then something softer beneath it. The Duchess saw to it. Your Grace, sent 2 men from the estate last month. It's all in order now. A pause. She came herself to check. After she came herself, said she wanted to be sure it was done right. Stayed near half an hour, she did. The woman's expression shifted slightly, not quite a question, but adjacent to one. She's well, Her Grace? Charles looked at Mrs. Fletcher, at the patched dress and the careful dignity of a woman who asked nothing from anyone and was genuinely asking, right now, out of actual concern, whether his wife was all right. She is away for a time, he said carefully. Visiting family. The woman nodded. Something behind her eyes went carefully neutral. Of course. Well, please do give her our regards. She's well. She's been very kind to this family, Your Grace. To a good many families on the estate. He walked back to the castle in the growing dark and felt the specific discomfort of a man beginning to understand something he had not understood before, something that had apparently been understood for quite some time by everyone around him. On the 4th day, Thomas found him. His son was 5 years old, serious and small, with his mother's dark eyes and a quality of careful attention that Charles sometimes found unnerving in a child. He appeared in the doorway of the study just before tea time, still wearing the mud on his boots from the garden, which meant Mrs. Calloway had been distracted. Where is Mama? Charles set down his pen. He turned to face his son with the particular deliberateness of a man who is trying to find the right words and is realizing he does not have them ready. She has gone to visit your Aunt Margaret in Hampshire. Thomas considered this. He had his mother's quality of sitting with information before responding to it. When is she coming back? I expect she will return shortly, Mrs. Calloway says she doesn't know when Mama is coming back, Mrs. Calloway does not have all the information, do you? Charles looked at his son, 5 years old, looking at him with those steady dark eyes, waiting for an answer, with the complete and unflinching expectation of someone who had not yet learned that adults sometimes did not have the answers to simple questions. I intend to find out, Charles said. Thomas seemed to weigh this response. After a moment, he stepped into the study and walked to his father's desk with the confidence of a child who had, apparently, always been welcome there, and Charles had a sudden, jarring memory of Eleanor bringing Thomas in here in the mornings when he was very small, sitting in the leather chair with the child in her lap, talking to him softly about whatever she was reading. He had seen it dozens of times. He had always been pleased by the image of it without ever coming over to join them. Will you write to her? Thomas climbed into the leather chair. I plan to. You should tell her about the fox. Thomas settled himself with the matter-of-fact authority of the very young. The one in the garden. She will want to know. Charles looked at his son. And, for the first time since he had stood in the empty doorway of Wetherbourne Castle 4 days ago, something in him shifted quietly and irreversibly, like a door swinging open on a room he had been walking past for years. Yes, he said slowly. I should tell her about the fox. He pulled a fresh piece of paper toward him. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked back at Thomas, who had found a book on the shelf and was turning the pages with the focused absorption of a child who had been raised, clearly and thoroughly, by a mother who read to him. Thomas, he said, what does your mother like? What does she talk about? When she is happy. His son looked up from the book, considering the question with the same careful patience Eleanor brought to everything. She likes the garden in the morning, Thomas said, before anyone else is up. She says it's the only time it belongs to her. He turned another page. She likes the tenants. She remembers all their names. She says a person's name is the first thing that belongs to them. He looked up again, meeting his father's eyes with that unnerving directness. She talks to me about you. Charles was very still. What does she say? Thomas thought about this for a moment. She says you carry a great deal. He turned back to the book, as though this were a simple and complete answer. She says sometimes people forget to put it down. The study was very quiet. Charles looked at the blank page in front of him, and at his son reading in the chair that had always been Eleanor's, and at the window where the last November light was draining out of the sky over the Yorkshire moors. And he understood, with a clarity that arrived, not with noise but with the specific and terrible quiet of things that had always been true, that there was no version of this story where he was the injured party. There was no misunderstanding to clarify. There was no letter to send that would efficiently resolve the situation. There was only a woman who had given him 6 years of careful and devoted service, not servitude. No, she had never been that, but service, the real kind, the kind that costs something, and who had finally decided that she was worth more than he had been willing to give. The question was not whether she was right. The question was what he intended to do about it. He did not sleep again that night. He sat at his desk until the fire burned low and the house around him settled into the particular stillness of 3 in the morning. And he thought about the early years, the first months of their marriage, when he had still been capable of curiosity about her, when he had written from London because he genuinely wanted to know how she was, when he had brought her small things from the city because her face when she was pleased by something was worth the trouble of finding something that would please her. He tried to identify the moment it had stopped. He could not find a single moment. That was the uncomfortable truth. It had not been an event, not a fight, not a decision, not a day when he had woken and chosen to stop paying attention. It had been an erosion, gradual, almost invisible. The way a riverbank goes not in one catastrophic slide, but in the slow, persistent wearing of ordinary days in which one thing after another became assumed rather than appreciated, expected rather than valued, taken for granted rather than seen. He had taken her for granted, not cruelly, not with any intention of harm. He had simply stopped looking, and she had remained there, in his house, managing his household, and raising his son, and keeping his tenants from ruin, and quietly waiting for him to turn his attention back to her. Until she had waited long enough that she understood he was not going to. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the letter she had written. He read it again. All of it. I cannot continue living where I must beg to be seen. He had given her everything a duchess required. The title, the estate, the position. He had been faithful. He had been financially responsible. He had, by any external measure, been a perfectly adequate husband in the Victorian sense of the term, which meant he had provided for her and protected her reputation and required little of her that was overtly unreasonable. He had never once asked himself whether that was enough. He folded the letter. He placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to his chest, where it was likely to stay, until he understood what it had cost her to write it. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began, for the first time in years, to write to his wife like a man who was actually trying to reach her. Not a request that she return, not a formal inquiry. Not the Duke of Wetherbourne addressing the Duchess. A husband writing to the woman he had married, a woman who had once looked up at him in a cold Hampshire church with everything she felt written plainly on her face and trying, for the first time in a very long time, to write back. He wrote slowly, he crossed things out. He started over. The fire burned down to embers, and he added another log and kept writing, because he had apparently a great deal of ground to cover, and he was not yet sure he had the language for any of it. But he was going to find it. Outside, Wetherbourne Castle was silent. The park was dark. The old oaks stood where they had always stood. And somewhere in Hampshire, or perhaps not Hampshire, but somewhere Eleanor Wycliffe sat with her dignity intact, and waited to find out whether the man she had fought was married, capable of something more than he had so far been willing to show. The fire crackled. Charles kept writing. The castle had never felt so large. The letter took him 4 hours to write and came to less than 2 pages. He had started it 3 times. The first attempt read like a formal summons proper, measured completely wrong. The second read like a defense, which was worse. The third time he forced himself to stop reaching for the language he knew and sit instead with the discomfort of not knowing what to say. And something closer to honesty came out of that. He posted it the next morning. He did not tell Hargreaves where it was going. He took it himself to the village and handed it across the counter and walked back up the hill to Wetherbourne in the sharp November air with the particular feeling of a man who has just done something irreversible and is not sure whether it was the right thing or merely the only thing left. 3 days passed, no reply. He had not expected quick reply. He told himself he had not expected a quick reply. On the fourth morning, he went back through the household records. Not the financial ledgers this time, those he had already read twice over, but the correspondence files that his secretary maintained. The thick-bound volumes of letters received and answered. The record of the estate's social and civic life over the past several years. He was looking, though he had not quite articulated it to himself in those terms. For Eleanor. He found her everywhere. A letter from the vicar in the village, dated 18 months ago, thanking the Duchess of Wetherbourne for her generous contribution to the restoration of the church roof. Charles had signed the check. He had no memory of being asked about the church roof, which meant Eleanor had handled the request, entirely identified the need, determined the appropriate amount, brought it to him at some moment when he had apparently agreed, without paying sufficient attention to remember it afterward. A letter from the wife of his northern estate manager, a woman he had met perhaps twice in life, addressed entirely to Eleanor, describing in warm and specific terms how her Grace's recommendation of a particular doctor in Leeds had saved the woman's youngest child from a dangerous illness. Eleanor had apparently been corresponding with this woman, a woman Charles could not have named without prompting, for the better part of 2 years. A letter from the secretary of the Yorkshire Agricultural Society, thanking the Duke of Wetherbourne for the submission of an analysis of crop rotation methods as they applied to the eastern field parcels. Charles had submitted no such analysis. He had no memory of any analysis. He read the letter twice, and then he went to the filing cabinet in the corner of Eleanor's sitting room, which Hargreaves had given him the key to, wordlessly that morning, and he looked until he found the draft. 47 pages, in Eleanor's handwriting with diagrams. An exhaustive, intelligent, quietly authoritative analysis of the agricultural management of his eastern parcels. Submitted under his name because the Agricultural Society did not accept submissions from women. He sat down on the small upholstered chair beside the writing desk, the one with the faded green cushion, where she had apparently spent a very great deal of time, and held 47 pages of her work in his hands, and was quiet for a long while. He thought about the quarterly review last spring, when his estate manager had mentioned improvements to the eastern parcels, with an efficiency that had not been there the year before. Charles had nodded. He had said something about sound management and moved on to the next item. He had accepted the credit without having done the work. Not because he had meant to steal it, but because he had not known there was anything to credit. He had not known because he had not asked. He set the document down carefully. He looked at the desk, the small, neat organization of it. The pen and inkwell positioned exactly where a right-handed person would place them. The stack of blank correspondence paper aligned with the edge. The way someone arranges a workspace they spend real time in, not a decorative surface they occasionally approach. This was where Eleanor had worked. This small room, with its faded chair and its north-facing window and its filing cabinet full of evidence of an entirely parallel life she had been running inside his house. And he had walked past the door every day. He left the room. He went down to the kitchen, which was not something he typically did, and appeared in the doorway with enough unexpectedness that Mrs. Tyndall, the cook, nearly dropped a pot lid. She recovered with admirable speed and dropped a curtsy. "Your Grace, Mrs. Tyndall. A moment, please." She straightened, cautious, with the alert expression of a woman who is trying to determine whether she is in trouble. "Her Grace," he said, "tell me what you know of her routine." A pause. Mrs. Tyndall glanced toward the kitchen maid, who found something extremely important to look at on the far side of the room. "Her Grace's routine, Your Grace? When did she work? How she spent her days here?" The cook's expression did something subtle, a shift between caution and something else. Something that might, in different circumstances, have been identified as barely controlled opinion. "She was up before anyone else most mornings, Your Grace. In the kitchen by 6:30 on her early days. She'd go through the household orders with me herself. She didn't leave that to the housekeeper entirely. She had her own way of knowing what was needed before it was needed, if you take my meaning." Charles did not entirely take the meaning, but he kept his expression neutral and kept listening. "She knew everyone's names," Mrs. Tyndall continued, warming slightly despite herself. "Every one of them. Not just the upstairs staff, the laundry girls, the stable hands. She knew which of the footmen had a sick mother in York and which of the kitchen maids was saving to bring her brother over from Ireland. A pause. She'd go to the village most weeks. Dr. Vicar. Sometimes the school teacher, that Mrs. Hollis on Prior Street, who teaches the tenant children. Her Grace was trying to get books sent up from London for the schoolroom. Charles was very still. I didn't know that. The cook looked at him with the measured expression of someone choosing their words carefully. No, Your Grace. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Charles let it sit. She was happy here? He heard the inadequacy of the question as soon as it left his mouth. But he needed to know, and this was the only direction from which he could approach it. Mrs. Tyndall considered for a moment long enough that it itself was an answer. Her Grace was devoted to Wetherbourne, the cook said finally, with the careful precision of someone drawing a very deliberate distinction. To the estate and the people on it. She gave it everything she had. Your Grace. Whether she herself was another pause. She never said otherwise to me. But there are things a woman keeps private. Your Grace. Yes, Charles said, there are. He left the kitchen. He went back to his study. He sat at his desk and looked at the wall, where a painting of the Wetherbourne parkland in summer had hung for as long as he could remember. He had always liked that painting. It was competent, well executed, expensive. He had no idea whether Eleanor liked it. He did not know what paintings she liked. He did not know what music she preferred, though they had sat in the same room during countless musical evenings over the past 6 years. He did not know her favorite book, though he had seen her reading consistently for as long as he had known her. He did not know whether she found Yorkshire winters difficult or whether she had grown to love them. He did not know what she thought about in the mornings, before anyone else was awake. He had been married to this woman for 6 years, and he did not know these things. The weight of that realization settled over him slowly, like something denser than air, not dramatic, not sudden, just persistent and heavy and entirely without escape. He had told her, once he could hear his own voice saying it. In the sitting room, perhaps 2 years ago, when she had tried to raise something with him, and he had been distracted by the month's correspondence, he had told her that she had everything a duchess could desire. As though the question of what she desired could be answered by the title. She had gone quiet after that. He had returned to his letters. He had not registered the quality of that quiet. He registered it now. He pulled out a sheet of paper. He was not writing another letter. He had already written and sent one letter and was waiting. And he would not flood her with correspondence, like a man making demands dressed up as contrition. Instead, he wrote a list. He had always been a man who organized his thoughts in lists. It was how he managed the complexity of the estate, the political concerns, the financial obligations. He used the same method now grimly because it was the only one he had. Things he did not know about his wife. He filled half a page before he stopped himself. Not because the list was complete, but because it was beginning to feel like an accounting of a kind of failure so comprehensive that continuing felt almost self-indulgent. He turned the paper over. He wrote a different list. Things he did know about Eleanor. She was calm in crises. He had seen it once when a fire broke out in the east stables. She had organized the evacuation of the horses and directed the staff with a clarity that had impressed him, and which he had mentioned to her. Once in passing, 3 days later, in the context of a larger conversation about estate management. He had not looked her in the eye when he said it. She was good with Thomas. Better than good, she was, the kind of mother who made it look effortless. Which he now suspected meant she was working very hard and making a point of not making it visible. Thomas had his mother's steadiness, his capacity for careful attention, his willingness to sit with a question before answering it. None of that had come from Charles. She never raised her voice. In 6 years of marriage, across every difficulty and frustration and occasion, when a raised voice would have been entirely justified, Eleanor had never once shouted at him. He had appreciated this in an abstract way. The way you appreciate good weather, without thinking much about what it cost. He stopped writing. He read the second list. It was shorter than the first. But what troubled him more was its nature. It was a list of things he had observed about Eleanor. Things he had witnessed without registering. It was not a list of things he knew because he had asked her. listened to her, engaged with her as a person whose inner life he had made a genuine effort to understand. He had watched his wife from across a very comfortable distance for 6 years, and called that a marriage. That evening, Thomas came again to the study. He had taken to doing this, appearing at the door in the hour before supper, as though testing whether the routine would hold, whether the study would be occupied, and the person in it willing to receive him. Charles had begun leaving the door open at that hour. He was not sure when he had started doing it, only that it felt important to keep doing it. The boy climbed into the leather chair, with a book he had apparently been reading in installments. He read. Charles worked or tried to work. The fire crackled. The house was quiet around them in a way that was not entirely empty. There was Thomas's small presence, which had more weight than a small person should perhaps have, and Charles found that he was less able to focus on the correspondence in front of him than usual, and more inclined to look up at his son reading in the chair. "Thomas," he said, was she ever unhappy here?" Thomas looked up from the book with a direct gaze that Charles had stopped finding unnerving and started finding what was the word. "Clarifying," she cried once. Charles was still. "When, after your last trip to London?" Thomas turned a page, though he was not reading it. "I went looking for her in the morning, and she was in the garden. She stopped when she saw me. She said the wind made her eyes water." A pause. "It wasn't windy." Charles said nothing. "I didn't say anything," Thomas continued, "because I thought if I pretended not to notice, she wouldn't feel embarrassed." He looked up again. "Did I do the right thing?" "Yes," Charles said after a moment. "You did exactly the right thing." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his book. Charles turned back to his desk and stared at the untouched correspondence for a long time. After the last London trip, he counted backward April. He had been to London in April for 3 weeks' parliamentary business, and a series of meetings with the men who handled the northern mineral rights, and 2 dinners at his club that had run late. He had returned to Wetherbourne in early May, and Eleanor had met him at the door. She had always met him at the door, and she had asked about the trip, and he had given her a brief account of it and gone to his study, because there was follow-up correspondence to attend to. He had not asked her about the 3 weeks he had been gone. He had not asked her what she had done, whether anything difficult had arisen with the household, how Thomas had been, how she had been. He had walked through the door of his own house after 3 weeks away and treated his return like the resumption of normal operations, with no apparent consideration of the fact that there was a person who had been living those 3 weeks without him and might have something to say about them. She had cried in the garden, and he had unpacked his bags and answered his letters. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily into the silence. Thomas turned another page. Charles sat very still with the specific stillness of a man who cannot move, because if he moves he will have to decide what to do next. And he does not yet trust himself to decide well. He needed to understand more. He needed to go further back than 3 weeks in April. He needed to understand not just the last failure, but the accumulation, the years of ordinary days, in which Eleanor had been present and attentive and quietly, consistently giving something of herself to this household and to him, and he had accepted it with the complete unconsciousness of a man who believes the world simply operates this way. He thought about the early months. 1880. The first winter of their marriage he had taken her to London for the season, and she had been extraordinary. He could see it now, with a sharpness that had not been available to him at the time, because at the time he had been caught up in the business of the season. The political dinners, the introductions. She had navigated it all with a self-possession that had made it look effortless. And he had been proud of her. He remembered being proud of her in the way that a man is proud of something that reflects well on him, without stopping to appreciate what it had taken from her. Lady Ashworth had said something to him at that first winter dinner. He could almost retrieve it now. She had leaned across the table and told him, with the particular candor of a woman in her 70s, who no longer cares what anyone thinks, that he had married someone quite exceptional, and that he ought to mind he didn't make the mistake of forgetting it. He had laughed. He had said something charming and deflecting. He had not retained the remark. Lady Ashworth had known what she was talking about. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one where he kept things that were not quite business, but not quite personal. The middle category that accumulates in any life lived at the intersection of the public and private. He found what he was looking for near the back, a small bundle of letters tied with a ribbon the color of which had faded from something definite to something indeterminate. Letters he had written to Eleanor in the first year of their marriage, during a trip to Scotland in the autumn of '81. He untied the ribbon. He read the first letter. His own handwriting, 5 years younger, looked looser, less controlled. He had asked her questions, real questions, not about the household, not about the estate, but about her. He had asked what she had been reading. He had asked whether she'd managed to visit the family in Hampshire, as she had been wanting to. He had described in detail that surprised him now, a conversation he'd had with an old friend about land management, and then had written, "I found myself disagreeing with Halford on 3 points, and I kept thinking you would have seen it more clearly than I did. I should very much like to know your view when I return." He read that line twice. He had once wanted to know her view. Somewhere between that letter and this November morning, he had stopped wanting to know her view, or rather, he had stopped asking himself whether he wanted to know it, which was a different kind of forgetting, but arrived at the same place. He set the letters down. He did not retie the ribbon. A knock at the study door, not Thomas's small knock, which had become familiar, but the measured 2-beat knock of Hargreaves. "Your Grace, there is a letter." Charles was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. He crossed the room and took the envelope from the tray, and recognized Eleanor's handwriting on the front and stood there holding it. Hargreaves withdrew without being asked. Charles was grateful for 19 years of well-trained discretion. He broke the seal. The letter was short, shorter than his had been. He read it in under a minute and then stood very still, because the brevity of it told him as much as the words. "Dear Charles, I received your letter. I read it more than once. I am glad you wrote. I want to believe what you have written. I am not certain yet that I can. I am not at Margaret's. I am in London at the Fairmont House on Belgrave Square. I did not tell you this to invite you to come. I am telling you because I do not wish to conduct this, whatever this is, in deception. That has never been my way. I need time, not as a punishment. Because I have spent 6 years arranging my life around your needs, and I do not yet know what it feels like to arrange a day around my own. I am well. Thomas must not worry, Eleanor." He read it a second time. She was in London. She had been in London, 23 miles from Wetherbourne, from the city where he had spent the better part of the past decade managing the affairs of the duchy. She had chosen London, deliberately chosen a place she had a right to be, her own family's townhouse, a place no one could question her presence. She was not hiding. She was not fleeing. She had positioned herself with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. "I have spent 6 years arranging my life around your needs." He sat back down at the desk. He read the line again. He read it until it stopped sounding like an accusation and started sounding like what it actually was. A statement of fact, delivered without drama or embellishment, by a woman who had simply run out of the particular energy required to go on, pretending that the arrangement was equitable. And he thought about the list he had made her, did not made earlier, things he did not know about Eleanor, and he thought about that morning in 9881 when he had sat in a cold room in Edinburgh and wanted to know her view. He thought about every dinner table they had shared, and every evening they had sat in the same room with books or correspondence, or the small ordinary business of a shared life. And he tried to count the evenings in which he had looked up from what he was doing and asked her a genuine question and listened to the full answer. The count was not good. He had told her, in the letter he had sent, that he understood something had gone wrong between them and that he wanted to address it. He had written it carefully, meaning every word, and had still managed to write it in a way that positioned the problem as a thing that had happened rather than a thing he had done. She had noticed. She had not said so directly, but the careful distance of her reply, "I want to believe what you have written." I am not certain yet that I can told him that she had read his letter with the attentiveness she brought to everything and had found it sincere but incomplete. She was right. He put her letter in the inside pocket of his jacket, next to the first one. He went to stand at the window. Outside, the park was beginning to accumulate the first suggestions of winter, the grass going gray. The bare oaks standing in their particular November dignity, the lake in the distance catching what little light remained. He had looked out this window 10,000 times. He had never once thought to describe what he saw to Eleanor, or to ask her what she saw when she looked out. He heard a door open down the corridor, Thomas's rooms, and then the voice of Mrs. Calloway telling him to wash before supper, and Charles stood at the window and thought about everything that had been happening in this house for 6 years without his proper attention. He thought about the church roof, the 47 pages of agricultural analysis, the doctor's bills for tenant workers, Tom Fletcher's roof repaired in October, the kitchen maid's brother in Ireland, the school books ordered from London, the letter from the estate manager's wife in Leeds, Mrs. Tyndall up early, going through orders with Eleanor before anyone else was awake. He thought about a woman crying in a garden in May and attributing it to the wind. He thought about a 5-year-old boy who had not said anything because he didn't want his mother to feel embarrassed. He thought about all the ways a person can be failing the people nearest to them without ever once doing anything that looks, from the outside, like a failure. His estate was well managed. His position was secure. His son was healthy. His household ran without apparent difficulty. And his wife had been slowly and quietly running out of reasons to stay. Right here inside these walls, while he stood at this window and looked out at the park and thought about nothing in particular. He left the window. He went to find Thomas, who was at the supper table, with a book propped against the salt cellar. And he sat down across from the boy and said, "Tell me about the fox." Thomas looked up, surprised, and then not something in his eyes shifting to a cautious, tentative warmth that Charles recognized with a lurch, because he had seen that expression before and not known what it was. It was the expression of someone who wants very much to trust that the attention they are receiving is real and is going to last. "He lives in the kitchen garden," Thomas said. "Mama found him first. She said he had a torn ear from a fight, and she called him Wellington." Charles almost smiled. Wellington, because he was battered but still standing. He looked at his son across the table, at the dark, serious eyes and the careful precision of the words, and the way Thomas watched him with that tentative hope, the same hope, he realized, that Eleanor had probably been watching him with for 6 years, waiting for him to notice. "I like that name," Charles said. Thomas nodded slowly. "I thought you would," he said, and went back to his book. And the warmth in his voice, when he said it was the warmth of someone who had not been certain, but had decided to hope anyway. Charles ate his supper. He listened to the house around him. He let the silence work on him instead of filling it, the way he usually filled it, with the comfortable noise of plans and obligations, and the business of being a duke. What had Eleanor needed from him? Not land, not title, not the management of a great estate. She had needed exactly what Thomas had just given him. Across a supper table, over the question of a fox named Wellington, presence. Actual, genuine, unhurried presence. The willingness to turn toward her and stay turned. He had given her position and comfort and the physical materials of a life. He had never given her his full attention for more than an hour at a time. And even then, he had been thinking about something else. The evening settled around Wetherbourne like a weight. The fire burned in the dining room grate. Thomas finished his supper and went, with the efficient pragmatism of childhood, back to his book. And Charles sat at the head of his table, in the house his family had owned for 2 centuries, in the chair that had always been his, and looked at the empty chair across from him that had always been Eleanor's. She had placed her wedding ring on a velvet square so it wouldn't be lost. Even leaving, she had been careful with what belonged to the house. He pushed back from the table. He went back to his study. He sat down at the desk, and he pulled out the letters, both of them, hers and the one from Scotland that he had written 5 years ago, and he read them in sequence, one after the other. Then he took out a fresh sheet of paper. And this time, he did not write like a duke addressing a problem. He did not write with the careful distance of a man trying to present himself as reasonable. He wrote instead, like the man who had sat in a cold Edinburgh room and wanted to know what she thought, because her thinking had seemed to him, in that autumn of 1881, like the most interesting thing within reach. He wrote until midnight. He crossed very little out. When he sealed the envelope, his hand was steady but his chest was not. He did not know yet what Eleanor would do. He did not know whether what he had written was enough, or whether enough even existed at this point, or whether she would read it and set it aside and continue the business of learning to arrange a day around her own needs, which she had apparently never had the chance to do. But he knew with a certainty that had not been available to him 4 days ago, when he had stood in the empty doorway and searched for her and not found her, that the man who had let this happen was not the man he intended to be going forward. And the only way to prove that to Eleanor, to prove it in any way that mattered, was to do what she had said in the first letter that she had needed all along. Show her she was seen, not by telling her she was seen, by actually turning to look. Eleanor's second letter arrived on a Tuesday. Charles had been in the estate office since early morning, working through the tenant ledgers with the focused attention of a man who has recently discovered that he has been signing off on things he did not understand. He was midway through a column of figures when Hargreaves appeared in the doorway with the silver tray, and Charles was on his feet before the butler had taken a second step into the room. He took the envelope. He did not open it immediately. He waited until Hargreaves had withdrawn, waited until the door was fully closed, and then he broke the seal with hands that were steadier than he felt. The letter was longer than the first. That told him something before he read a word of it. Dear Charles, I have read your second letter 4 times. I want to be honest with you about what I felt reading it, because I think honesty is the only thing left between us that is worth anything. I felt hope, and then I felt afraid of the hope, because I have felt hope before, and I know what it costs when it turns out to be misplaced. You wrote that you have been going through the household records, that you found the agricultural analysis, that you spoke with Mrs. Tyndall. I do not write these things to you to be praised for them. I write them because they needed doing, and no one else was going to do them. But I will tell you this, I stopped expecting you to notice a long time ago. And when a woman stops expecting to be noticed, something in her goes quiet. Not in an angry way. In the way of a door that has been closed so many times it eventually stays shut. I am not writing to punish you. I am writing because you asked me to. And because despite everything, I still believe you are capable of more than you have shown me. I will come back to Wetherbourne for one evening. Not to resume our life as it was. I am not capable of that. And I do not think it would serve either of us. But there are things I need to say to you in person, and things I believe you need to hear, and a letter is not the right place for them. I will come on Friday. I ask only that we be alone, without the formal machinery of a dinner party or the staff arranging things around us. Just us at table and the truth. Eleanor, he read it standing up. Then he sat down. Then he read it again. She was coming back. Not to stay, she had been careful to specify that, with the precision she brought to everything, but she was coming. She was willing to sit at a table with him and say the things that needed saying. That was more than he had earned, and some part of him knew it. Friday was 3 days away. He spent those 3 days differently than he had spent the first week after her departure. The initial shock had given way to something more productive, not action for action's sake, but a deliberate attempt to understand the shape of what he had failed at, so that he could meet her on Friday with something more than apology. Apology, he was beginning to understand, was the easiest and least useful thing he could offer. Eleanor had not written 2 careful, honest letters because she wanted him to be sorry. She wanted him to understand. He visited Tom Fletcher himself. This time, the man was weathered and direct and clearly uncomfortable with the Duke's presence on his doorstep. But he answered Charles's questions about the roof, and about the October storm, and about the way the estate had responded with a candor that was only possible between people who are not pretending. At the end of the conversation, Tom Fletcher looked at him with the evaluating gaze of a man who works the land and has no particular reason to spare feelings. Her Grace came herself, Fletcher said. 3 times. She came. Once to look at the damage, once to check the repairs were being done right. Once to see they'd held a pause. My wife asked after her last week. We heard she was away. She is, Charles said, visiting family. The same careful phrase he had used with Mrs. Fletcher. And Tom gave him the same careful look. His wife had given the look of someone who has heard the explanation and is not entirely certain it accounts for everything. Charles walked back from the Fletcher cottage with the specific discomfort of a man who has just had his private situation reflected back to him by people who are too decent to say what they actually think. The tenants knew something was wrong. Of course they did. Wetherbourne was not a large world, it was an enclosed one. And Eleanor had made herself known in every corner of it. And her absence was felt in every corner of it, and no one was going to say so directly to the Duke's face. But everyone was watching to see what would happen next. What happened next depended on Friday. He asked Hargreaves to arrange the dining room for two. Informally, no footmen standing at intervals, no elaborate service. He asked Mrs. Tyndall to prepare the kind of meal that did not require ceremony. And then he asked Hargreaves, with as much casualness as he could manage, what Her Grace typically requested for supper when it was just herself and Thomas. Hargreaves did not blink. Roast chicken, Your Grace. A simple soup. She was fond of Mrs. Tyndall's apple tart. Then that, Charles said. And Hargreaves withdrew with the perfect, expressionless efficiency of a man who has witnessed an enormous amount and will take all of it to his grave. Eleanor arrived on Friday at 5:30. Charles heard the carriage on the gravel drive and positioned himself in the entrance hall, not performing welcome. Just standing there, because it seemed important not to reduce this moment to theater. He heard the door open. He heard her voice thanking the coachman. Low and clear and entirely composed, and then she was in the doorway. 6 years of marriage, and he had forgotten, or rather, he had stopped seeing the specific quality of Eleanor's composure. It was not the brittle composure of a woman suppressing feeling. It was something deeper than that. Something that came from having spent a long time deciding very carefully who she was going to be. She stood in the doorway of Wetherbourne Castle in a traveling dress the color of dark slate, without jewels except the small earrings that had belonged to her mother. And she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. Charles, Eleanor. He moved toward her, and then stopped because he was not certain of the right gesture. Not certain what she would permit. And for the first time in his adult life, he found that uncertainty clarifying rather than intolerable. It meant he was paying attention. Thank you for coming. She looked at him for a moment, assessing. Careful, not unkind. Thomas? In the nursery, Mrs. Calloway has him. I thought you might want to see him after we spoke. Something moved behind her eyes. Not warmth exactly, but the precursor to it. Yes, she said. After. They went to the dining room. Hargreaves had arranged it simply. As instructed, 2 places at the near end of the long table. The candles lit but low, the room warm without being overwrought. Eleanor sat and looked at the table setting, and Charles saw her register the menu without comment, and then she looked up at him with an expression that was almost a question. Mrs. Tyndall told me, he said, a pause. She looked down at her hands. Then back up. U.S. She was quiet for a moment. Not comfortable quiet, the quiet of someone absorbing something unexpected and deciding what to do with it. Charles, before we eat, before anything else, she placed her hands flat on the table. I need you to understand why I am here, and why I am not staying, all right? I am not here to be persuaded, she said. I am not here because I believe 2 letters and a correctly ordered supper means everything is resolved. I am here because 6 years of marriage deserves more than a note on a desk. And because I am not a woman who walks away from things without saying them to someone's face. The directness of it was startling, not because she was being cruel, but because he had not known she had this gear. 6 years. And he had never heard Eleanor speak with this particular, stripped-down precision. He had seen her be competent. Gracious, warm, quietly persistent. He had not seen her be exact. I understand, he said. I don't think you do yet. She kept her eyes on him, not combative. Not cold, just steady. But I am going to tell you. And then you will. Supper arrived. They let the food sit mostly untouched for the first quarter of an hour while Eleanor spoke, and Charles listened with the full, uncomfortable attention of a man who has decided that listening is the only honest thing left to offer. She told him about the first year. About learning the shape of Wetherbourne and its household and its obligations, and how she had thrown herself into that learning because she genuinely loved it, loved the work, loved the people, loved the complexity of managing something that mattered. She told him how she had written to his estate managers and visited the tenants and reorganized the household accounts because there were inefficiencies that cost them money and unnecessary difficulties that made people's lives harder than they needed to be. I was not doing it for praise, she said. I want to be clear about that. I did it because it needed doing and because I am good at it. But I will tell you something, Charles, the first year, when we were still speaking to each other as though we were genuinely curious about each other's minds, she paused. You asked me once what I thought about the situation with the Hendersons. The family in the North Cottage, the dispute about the grazing boundary. Charles remembered, faintly distantly, a conversation in the library. Early in their marriage, I gave you my analysis, Eleanor continued. You listened. You actually listened. And then you said my reading of Henderson's position was sharper than your solicitor's. And you used it. Do you remember what happened after that? I resolved the dispute with Henderson, he said carefully. You resolved the dispute with Henderson, she agreed. And you told Farnsworth, your solicitor, that you had been reviewing the file yourself. A beat. You did not mention that the analysis had come from me. He opened his mouth. Closed it. I am not telling you that to revisit an old grievance, she said. I am telling you because that moment was the first one. That was when I understood the shape of what our marriage was going to be. You would use what I gave you. You would value it. In the sense that you would put it to use. But you could not acknowledge it. Because a duke does not consult his wife on legal matters. A duke does not explain to his solicitor that his conclusions came from the woman who sits at the other end of his dinner table. Eleanor, I adapted. Her voice was quiet and completely level. I am good at adapting. I found other channels. The Agricultural Society submission, you received credit for that work at 4 separate dinners that year. I watched men shake your hand and congratulate you on your analytical rigor, and I smiled and said nothing. Because that was the only way the work would have any effect at all. She looked at him directly. Do you understand how that feels? He held her gaze. He did not look away. No, he said, I don't, but I am trying to. Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but a different quality of attention. She picked up her fork, then set it down again. There was a dinner, she said. Last spring, Lord and Lady Harmont and the Prestons and the Ashworths. You seated me at the far end of the table, which was correct. Procedurally, I understand the protocol, and I spent the evening discussing the weather and Lady Preston's daughter's upcoming season with 3 women who were bored. And you spent the evening discussing the Irish question and the future of the Lords with the 5 most interesting people in the room. A pause. Afterward, in the carriage, I asked you what Ashworth had said about the redistribution bill. He did not remember this. You gave me a 3-sentence summary, Eleanor said. And then you asked whether the flower arrangements had been satisfactory. She let the silence sit for a moment. That was not an accident, Charles, I know that. The seating, the conversation, the assumption that my interest in those questions was social rather than genuine, none of it was deliberate cruelty. But it accumulated, year by year, dinner by dinner. It accumulated into a life in which I was somewhere between staff and ornament. And you were the only person in Wetherbourne who didn't seem to notice. The candles guttered slightly in a draught from the corridor. Charles sat with what she had said. You are right, he said. I know I am right. Her voice was not sharp. It was the voice of someone who has been right for a long time and found very little satisfaction in it. What I don't know is what you intend to do with that. I intend to change, he said. And then, because she had asked him for honesty and the least he could do was match it. I know that is the easiest thing to say. I know you have no reason to believe it. I am not asking you to believe it. I am asking you to what? Charles? She looked at him steadily. Give you another chance? Stay in this house and wait to see if this time is different. I don't know. He put his glass down. I don't know what to ask for. I only know that I have spent 2 weeks learning the shape of what I have been missing. And it is considerably larger than I thought. A silence settled between them, not hostile, not comfortable. The silence of 2 people who are being more honest with each other than they have been in years and have not yet worked out what comes next. Eleanor reached for her wine glass. She held it without drinking. I do not need perfection from you, she said quietly. I want you to understand that. I never needed you to be perfect. I only needed to know I mattered. Not the Duchess. Not the manager of your household. Me, she set the glass down. Do you know what I mean by that? Tell me, he said. Because he thought he was beginning to understand. But he needed to hear it in her words. There was a morning in March. Thomas had been ill for several days. And I had been up with him most of 3 nights, and on the 4th morning he turned the corner, and I knew he would be all right. And I came downstairs, and you were at breakfast reading your correspondence. She kept her voice very even. And I sat down, and I poured my tea, and I thought, I could tell him. I could tell him that I am exhausted and relieved, and that I have not slept properly in 4 days, and that I love that boy more than I knew I could love anything. I could tell him all of that. Charles was completely still. And then I thought, he will look up from his letter, and he will say, good. Glad the boy is better, and he will go back to reading. She looked at him. So I didn't say anything. I drank my tea, and that was the morning I stopped telling you things. The fire in the grate shifted. The clock on the mantelpiece continued its steady work. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Charles said, he was ill for 4 days? 3 nights and 4 days, Eleanor said. You came to the nursery door once. You asked Calloway if it was serious. She told you the doctor had been, and it was not life-threatening. You said good and went to your study. He had no memory of this. That was perhaps the worst part, not that he had failed her in that moment, but that the moment had not registered at all. It had slipped past him without leaving a mark. The way water runs off a surface that has been sealed against it. Eleanor, he said, and then stopped, because there was no adequate sentence. I know. Her voice was gentle, which was somehow worse than if it had been angry. That is exactly it, Charles. I know, I have always known. You are not a cruel man. You are not indifferent to the people you love in any deliberate sense. You simply never looked. She touched the stem of her wineglass. And I made the mistake for 6 years of believing that if I was useful enough, valuable enough, indispensable enough, you would eventually look. And I didn't, he said. You did not. He felt the truth of it settle into him not as accusation but as fact. Clean and terrible and entirely without escape, she was not dramatizing. She was not manufacturing grievances. She was describing. With the same precise intelligence she had brought to 47 pages of agricultural analysis, the actual shape of what had happened between them. And it was exactly as she described. You said in your letter, he began, that you were afraid the hope was misplaced. She looked at him. Is it, he asked, misplaced? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the table, at the candles, at her hands. When she looked back up, her expression was the most unguarded he had seen it all evening. I don't know yet, she said. That is the honest answer. I came here tonight expecting— She paused. I came here expecting you to explain. To justify. To manage this conversation the way you manage everything efficiently. Conclusively, with a clear plan for resolution. Her eyes held his. You haven't done that. No, he said. I haven't. You have been listening, she said. Slowly, as though confirming something she was still in the process of deciding. You have actually been listening. It is long overdue. Another silence, but this one had a different quality than the ones before it. Less like a wall, more like an open question. Eleanor pushed back slightly from the table. She stood and walked to the window, and stood with her back to him for a moment. When she turned around, her composure was intact, but her eyes were bright. Charles, her voice was low, I am going to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it, not just the part that is convenient. All right, I still love you. The words were not tender, they were delivered with the same stripped-down honesty as everything else she had said that evening. And they landed with corresponding force. I want to be clear that I am not leaving because I stopped loving you. I loved you when I packed my cases. I loved you when I left that letter on your desk. I love you right now, sitting at this table, and it has made not one bit of difference to the fact that I have been invisible in this house for 4 years. Charles stood up. He could not sit still for this, not because he wanted to escape it, but because his body needed to be upright for what came next. Then come back, he said. Tell me what you need. Tell me, I will listen. I am listening now. Eleanor looked at him across the table with an expression that was not hope and not its absence, but something between the two, the careful, undefended face of a woman who is deciding in real time How much to risk? You are making a tragedy out of ordinary marriage difficulties, he had told her once. He had said it in this very house, in this very season, and the memory of it arrived now with a force that nearly made him close his eyes. He had said it because he had genuinely believed it had thought that what she was describing was the ordinary friction of domestic life. The kind of thing that resolved itself with time and patience and the mutual willingness of sensible people to move forward. He had not known then what it cost her to hear it. He knew now. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. The clock continued. Somewhere upstairs, a door opened and closed. Thomas, probably restless in the nursery, too aware of his mother's presence in the house to fully settle. "I need to think," she said finally. "I cannot give you an answer tonight." He had expected this. He had told himself, walking back from Tom Fletcher's cottage, that the most important thing he could do on Friday was listen and not demand. Not push, not treat her returning to Wetherbourne as a problem to be solved in a single evening. "I know," he said. "Take the time you need." She crossed back to the table. She looked at the dinner that had sat mostly untouched through the most important conversation they had perhaps ever had, and something almost like a rueful smile moved across her face. "Mrs. Tyndall will never forgive us. I will make our apologies." Eleanor sat back down, picked up her fork and ate a few bites of the soup that had gone cold. Charles did the same. They sat at the table in a quiet that was no longer hostile, not warm. Not resolved, but inhabited differently than it had been an hour ago. She told him about London, about the Fairmont house on Belgrave Square, which had been empty since her parents died, and which needed work, the kind of gradual deterioration that happens to houses that are not regularly lived in. She had spent the first week finding a good builder and a reliable housekeeper. She had slept 9 hours a night for the first time in years. She had eaten breakfast at whatever time she chose, without considering anyone else's schedule. "I did not know how tired I was," she said. "Until I wasn't anymore." "I didn't know you were tired," he said. And then, because honesty was all they had left, "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have." After supper, she went upstairs to see Thomas. Charles waited in the library, because it seemed right to give her that time alone with the boy, to let her be, for a little while, just his mother, and not the subject of a marital crisis. He heard Thomas's voice through the ceiling, rapid, excited, telling her about Wellington the fox, with the kind of comprehensive detail that only a 5-year-old can sustain on the subject of an animal, and he heard Eleanor's voice underneath it, warm and low and steady. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of his wife, laughing at something his son had said. She came back down an hour later. Her composure had been replaced by something less armored, the softness of a woman who has just spent an hour with a small child who loves her without qualification. "He is well," she said. "Not quite a question. He talks about you every day." She pressed her lips together briefly. She picked up her gloves from the hall table. "Eleanor." He stepped toward her. "I have to tell you something, and I should have told you years ago. And I am going to tell you now, because I have run out of reasons to wait." He stopped close enough that he could see the shift in her expression, the guarding coming up, the wariness, the Henderson analysis, the agricultural submission, the church roof, the Fletcher cottage, the doctor's bills. All of it. "I have been walking through a house that you were holding up, and I told myself I was the one holding it." Her throat moved. "I will not ask for your forgiveness tonight. You don't owe me that yet." He held her gaze. "But I want you to know that I see it, all of it. I see what you built here. I see what it cost you, and I am not going to pretend otherwise to protect my own dignity." Eleanor stood very still for a moment. Then she said quietly, "That is the first thing you have said to me in 6 years that I did not already know you were going to say." She put on her gloves. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "I will write," she said, "when I have thought." "I will wait," he said, "for as long as it takes." She left. The carriage took her back down the drive and out through the Wetherbourne gates. And Charles stood in the entrance hall and listened to the wheels on the gravel until there was nothing left to hear. Then he went to his study. He sat at his desk. He opened the middle drawer and took out a sheet of paper and stared at it for a long time. He had told her he would wait. He meant it. but sitting in the silence of Wetherbourne, with only the fire and the clock and the memory of her voice, asking whether she had ever mattered, sitting with all of that pressing down on a man who had spent 40 years believing that providing was the same as loving. He understood something that no letter could have told him, and no amount of ledger reviewing could have taught him. She had not left because she stopped loving him. She had left because she finally stopped waiting for him to love her back in the only way that had ever counted. The candle burned low. Charles sat in the empty castle and felt the truth of that work its way through him slowly, without mercy, the way the deepest truths always move until it reached whatever part of him had been sealed off for years, and found it against all probability still open. She did not write for 11 days. Charles counted them. He was not proud of counting them, but he counted them the way a man counts the days after a wound, not because counting helps, but because the mind needs something to do with the waiting. The Friday dinner had changed something between them, he felt it. And he believed she had felt it too, but changed things are not fixed things. And he had promised her time and meant it, and so he waited. He managed the estate. He reviewed the tenant ledgers with new eyes. He visited the Hendersons and the Fletchers, and an elderly couple named Birch, on the south boundary of the property, whom Eleanor had apparently been visiting every third Tuesday for 2 years, bringing them coal, and according to Mrs. Birch, sometimes just sitting with them for half an hour, because Mr. Birch's eyesight had gone, and he could no longer read, and he missed being read to. Charles had not known any of this. He sat with the Birches for 40 minutes on a cold Thursday afternoon, and let Mr. Birch tell him at length about the state of the northern wall and the particular way the wind came off the moor in December. And when he stood to leave, Mrs. Birch touched his arm with the careful, deliberate gesture of a very old woman who chooses her gestures with intention. "She always said you were a good man," Mrs. Birch told him. "Her Grace. She always said so." A pause. "I hope she's right." He walked home. On the 11th day the letter arrived. I recognized Eleanor's handwriting on the envelope before Hargreaves had fully extended the tray, and he took it with a restraint that cost him considerably more than it appeared to. He went to his study, he sat down, he opened it. "Dear Charles, I have been thinking about Friday. I have been thinking about it more than I intended to, which is perhaps something in itself. I came to Wetherbourne expecting a negotiation. I expected you to present your case, measured, reasonable, persuasive, and for me to listen and feel the familiar pull of wanting to believe you and being afraid to. That is what I prepared myself for on the journey down. That is not what happened. I am not ready to come home. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than comfort. I am not ready, and I am not certain of the shape of what ready will look like when I find it. But I am less far from it than I was. I have been working on the Belgrave house. There is more to be done than I initially thought. The east rooms need replastering, and the kitchen requires entirely new fittings. I have been managing the builders, and I find that I am, unexpectedly, enjoying it. Having a problem in front of me that is entirely mine to solve, without reference to anyone else's schedule or preferences or requirements, is something I had forgotten the feeling of. I will come again before Christmas. Not to stay, but to see Thomas and to continue. I do not know yet what I am continuing toward, but I am continuing. Eleanor, he read it 3 times. He set it in the drawer with the others he had begun, keeping them in order. Her letters and his, in a sequence that told a story he was still in the middle of. She was not coming home, not yet, but she was coming. And she was continuing, and that word continuing sat in his chest for the rest of the day, with a warmth he recognized as disproportionate and did not try to diminish. He wrote back that evening. Brief, careful. He was learning the register she needed from him. The difference between saying enough and saying too much. He told her that he was glad the Belgrave house was giving her something useful to do. He told her that the east rooms needing replastering was probably connected to the drainage issue on that side of the building, which he recalled her father mentioning once, and that she should have the builder check the exterior wall before committing to interior work. He told her Thomas had named 2 of the stable kittens, and that one of them had been named Eleanor, which Thomas appeared to consider a compliment. He sealed the letter. He held it for a moment before giving it to Hargreaves. He had written to her about drainage and kittens, and it had felt, for the first time in years, like genuine conversation. The weeks that followed had their own particular rhythm, strange. Suspended, nothing like the life of Wetherbourne Castle as it had existed for the previous 6 years. Charles had always been a man who moved forward, who operated on the premise that difficulties were managed and dispensed with, and life proceeded. He had never been good at suspension, at living in the space between one thing and the next, where there was nothing to decide yet, only things to understand. He was learning. He learned, for instance, that the morning tea situation was not a small thing. In the first week after Eleanor left, the kitchen had sent up a pot of Darjeeling, which was what they apparently understood the Duke to prefer. It was not what he preferred. He had preferred a different blend, a stronger Assam mix, since approximately 1878. And Eleanor had quietly ensured it was what arrived every morning. And now that she was gone, the knowledge had departed with her. He had drunk Darjeeling for a week before he mentioned it to Hargreaves. And the expression on the butler's face, carefully neutral, but fractionally too careful, told him that Hargreaves was filing the information away in the same mental category as all the other things that were apparently returning to His Grace's attention now. That Her Grace was no longer managing them invisibly. He learned that the correspondence system, Eleanor had established a method of organizing incoming mail by urgency and subject, with flagged items that required personal attention separated from those that could be handled by the secretary, had not been documented anywhere. It had lived entirely in Eleanor's head and in the small daily habits she had developed without being asked to develop them. In her absence, the mail piled in the order it arrived. And twice in the first fortnight, Charles had very nearly missed a response deadline for something that required his direct attention, saved each time by his secretary's increasingly anxious reminders. He learned that there were 3 families on the estate whose situations were more precarious than his financial records suggested, because the records reflected official arrangements and Eleanor's system of informal assistance operated in the margins of the official record, through small disbursements and personal interventions that did not appear in the ledgers as such. He only discovered the Maitland family's situation by accident. He had gone to inspect a fence line on the eastern boundary and found young James Maitland, 12 years old, working the fence himself instead of being at the village school where he belonged. "Why aren't you at school?" Charles asked the boy directly. James Maitland had the instinctive wariness of a child who has learned that direct questions from people with authority often lead to trouble. "Father's back's bad, sir. Someone's got to work." "Since when?" "August." Sir, a pause. "Her Grace used to. She sent someone from the estate to help with the heavy work. But that stopped when the boy stopped with the sensitivity of a child who is registered that he is navigating adult territory. When she went away." Charles stood at the fence line in the December cold and looked at a 12-year-old boy who was missing school because Eleanor's informal support system had dissolved without anyone knowing it existed, and felt the specific kind of anger that is really aimed at oneself. He sent an estate worker to the Maitlands the next morning. He arranged for James to return to school, and then he went back to the household records, and in 3 days doing nothing but trying to map the full extent of what Eleanor had been running, informally and entirely from memory, in the space between the official operations of the Wetherbourne estate and the actual lives of the people on it. By the end of those 3 days he had filled 14 pages of notes. He was not certain it was complete. He sat back from the desk. He pressed his hands flat against the surface. 14 pages of things Eleanor had been doing, most of which he had not known about, all of which were now his to manage or let fall. And she had been doing them simultaneously with everything else: the household management, the social obligations, the raising of Thomas, the correspondence, the 47 pages of agricultural analysis submitted under his name. He thought about what she had said at the Friday dinner. "I found other channels. The Agricultural Society submission, you received credit for that work at 4 separate dinners that year. I watched men shake your hand and congratulate you on your analytical rigor, and I smiled and said nothing." He had been managing Wetherbourne. He had genuinely believed that. He had believed it the way you believe something that has never been examined, because no one has ever given you cause to examine it. He had stood at the head of his dinner table and accepted compliments on the smooth running of his estate and the good condition of his tenants and the sound management of his finances. And beneath all of it, Eleanor had been the actual architecture of the thing. Invisible by necessity, giving him the credit, because the alternative was that the work would have had no effect at all. He had let her do that. He had been the comfortable beneficiary of a system of concealment that the world had forced on her. And he had never once asked himself how that system felt to the person running it. He needed to do something with this. Not just understand it and do something with it. Something that could not be taken back or explained away. Something that would tell Eleanor, in the plainest possible terms, that the man who had let her be invisible was not the man currently sitting at this desk. He thought for a long time. Then he went to find Hargreaves. The Yorkshire Agricultural Society's annual dinner, he said. When is it? Hargreaves considered. 3rd week of January. Your Grace, you typically attend. I intend to attend this year. But I need to speak with Secretary Ashford beforehand. He paused. There is a matter I wish to address at the dinner. Publicly. Hargreaves maintained his expression with professional excellence. Of course, Your Grace. Shall I arrange a meeting with Mr. Ashford? This week. He met with Ashford 4 days later, a careful, conventional man who handled the society's affairs with the meticulous anxiety of someone who considers any deviation from established procedure a potential catastrophe. Charles sat across from him in the society's offices in York and explained what he wanted to do, and watched Ashford's face move through surprise, confusion, and what appeared to be genuine alarm. You wished to publicly attribute the submission to Her Grace, Ashford said slowly, with the tone of a man repeating back an instruction he hopes he has misunderstood. I wish to correct the record, Charles said. The submission was Her Grace's work. It was submitted under my name because your society's rules did not permit submission by a woman. Those rules are, in my view, an embarrassment to the institution. I intend to say so. Ashford Grace. This is highly irregular. The members will, yes, Charles said. They will. He looked at Ashford steadily. I trust that will not be a problem. There was a long pause in which Ashford appeared to conduct an internal negotiation of some complexity. No, he said finally, with the resignation of a man who has recognized the battle he is not going to win. I don't suppose it will. Charles told no one at Wetherbourne about the planned speech. He told no one because there was no one to tell Eleanor was in London. And he had no intention of telling Eleanor in advance, because he needed her to hear it from a position of complete surprise, in a public room, from the mouths of people who had no reason to flatter him. He needed her to hear it and know that it had not been arranged for her benefit. It had been arranged because it was right. He visited the Birches again. 2 days before Christmas. Mr. Birch was having a better day than last time, more alert, more talkative, and Charles sat with them for over an hour. And when he stood to leave, Mrs. Birch held his hand in both of her small gnarled ones and looked up at him with the direct assessment of a woman who has very little left to lose. You're different, she said, than the last time you came. I am trying to be. She'll notice, Mrs. Birch said firmly. Eleanor always notices, that's her trouble. Really, she notices everything and says nothing. A pause. With the prerogative of the very old. You let her do that for too long, I know, Charles said. Don't tell her I said so, I won't. The old woman released his hand. Satisfied, Charles walked back across the estate in the approaching dark and thought about a woman who noticed everything and said nothing, and about how long he had let that be the arrangement, and about the fact that the arrangement had suited him so perfectly that he had never once questioned it. Eleanor came on the 23rd of December, as she had said she would. Thomas heard the carriage first. He was in the hall, and Charles heard the boy's footsteps accelerate from a dignified walk to something considerably less dignified. And then Eleanor's voice, warm, slightly breathless. The particular voice she used only with Thomas, lower and freer than her usual register. Charles stayed in the library. He gave them 10 minutes before he appeared in the doorway. Eleanor was kneeling on the hall floor with her arms around Thomas, who was telling her about Wellington the Fox with the urgency of a child communicating intelligence of the highest strategic importance. She looked up when Charles appeared. Her hair was slightly disordered from the journey, and from Thomas's enthusiastic reception, and she had the particular expression of a woman who has been ambushed by love and doesn't mind. "He has survived the December cold," Charles said. "The fox, Thomas checks on him daily." Eleanor stood, keeping one hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Of course he has. Wellington is resilient. Mrs. Tyndall would like to know if you're staying for dinner." A beat. "Yes," Eleanor said. "If that's yes." They had dinner with Thomas at the table, which was not the usual arrangement for formal Wetherbourne dinners, but which felt, this particular evening, entirely correct. Thomas was incandescent with the excess of Christmas approaching, and his mother's presence, and the news that he intended to share, which included detailed reports on every animal, person, and event at Wetherbourne since Eleanor's last visit. Eleanor listened to all of it, with genuine attention, the kind of listening that meant she asked questions and remembered the answers, and connected them to things Thomas had told her in letters. Charles listened to them both, and thought about how a child learns to listen, by watching the people who love him. After Thomas was in bed, they sat in the library. Eleanor held her tea. Charles held nothing, having learned that he was less likely to fidget without something in his hands. "The Maitland boy," he said. "James. I found out about his situation. I've arranged for support until his father's back heals." Eleanor's expression shifted, careful. "Watching. How did you find out?" "I was checking the fence line on the eastern boundary. Found him working it alone." He met her eyes. "You'd been supplementing the Maitlands for months. When you left, it stopped, and I didn't know it existed to continue." A silence. Eleanor set down her tea. "There are others," she said carefully. "I know, I spent 3 days mapping them." He paused. "I filled 14 pages. Something moved in her face. Not quite surprise, more like the expression of someone watching confirmation of something they had half believed. "I didn't write it down," because she began. "Because it would have required explaining a system I was running informally, with estate funds you would have questioned. And the conversation would have been..." She stopped. "Difficult." "Yes," he said, "I understand that now." He leaned forward. "Eleanor, I need you to know that I am not managing this as a performance. I am not..." He stopped himself. "What I mean is, I know it is easy to say the right things. I know that. I know you have no particular reason to believe the saying of things. But I intend to show you." She looked at him. "How?" "In January," he said. "At the Agricultural Society dinner, I intend to address the membership and correct the record on the Eastern Parcel submission." Eleanor was very still. "What do you mean, correct the record?" "I mean, attribute the work to the person who did it." The quiet that followed was unlike any quiet he had heard from her before. It was not the careful quiet of a woman choosing her words, or the distant quiet of a woman who has stopped expecting things. It was the quiet of genuine surprise, the specific silence of someone who has been braced for one thing and received another. "Charles," her voice was low. "The society doesn't," he said. "I have already spoken with Ashford. He is aware of what I intend to say. You will be there, will be objections. Significant objections. Men who have known your family for..." "Yes," he said simply. "There will be." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. In her eyes he could see the calculation happening, the same intelligence that had written 47 pages of agricultural analysis, now applied to the question of whether this was real, whether he had actually understood, whether this was the beginning of something or the last performance of a man still trying to manage a situation. "Why?" she asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because it is right," he said, "and because you have been invisible in this house for 4 years. And I am responsible for that, and there is very little I can do to undo it. But I can start by being honest about what is yours." Eleanor pressed her lips together. She looked away toward the fire, and he saw the brightness in her eyes that she was not going to let become tears, not because she was suppressing it, but because she was deciding consciously how much to let him see. "I am not coming home yet," she said, still looking at the fire. "I want to be clear about that, I know. The Belgrave house," she stopped. "I am not ready to give it up. What I have there, the freedom of it, I am not ready to trade it back. I am not asking you to trade it." She turned back to look at him. Something in her expression sharpened. "What are you asking?" he thought carefully. This was the question he had been preparing for, in the back of his mind. Since the Friday dinner, not the words of it, but the honesty of it. What was he actually asking for? Not the performance of asking, not the strategically correct answer, but the real one. "I am asking you to let me prove something," he said. Not with promises, with time. He held her gaze. "I am asking you to leave the door open. That is all. Leave it open, and let me show you that the man who read those letters from Edinburgh in 1881 and wanted to know your view, let me show you he is still here." Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Thomas's clock ticked in the hall. The fire settled. "The drainage on the east side of the Belgrave house," she said finally. "You were right. The builder found a problem in the exterior wall, exactly where you said it would be." He blinked. "It saved me a significant amount of money and 3 weeks of replastering that would have failed anyway." She picked up her tea again. Her expression had not precisely softened. It was more that something behind it had shifted. The way a lock shifts when the right key is applied. "You knew because you were paying attention to something I mentioned in a letter. Something I did not think you would remember." "I remembered," he said. "I know." She looked at him over the rim of the teacup. "That is why I am telling you." They sat in the library until well past 10. They actually talked, the way he had been trying to remember how to do since he found those letters from Edinburgh. She told him about the Belgrave builders, and about a woman she had met through her cousin who was involved in the movement for women's property reform, and about a lecture she had attended in London on modern agricultural methods that had, she said, several points of direct relevance to the eastern parcels at Wetherbourne. He listened, he asked questions, real questions, the kind where the answer mattered, and he was going to remember it. When she stood to leave, she was staying at a hotel on the York Road. Not at Wetherbourne, a boundary she had set and he respected. She paused at the library door and turned back. "Thomas told me," she said, "that you have been leaving the study door open at tea time." He looked at her. "He said you sit with him while he reads." A pause. "He said it's his favorite part of the day." Her voice was even, but her eyes were not. "I wanted you to know that I know that. And that it matters." She left. He heard the carriage on the gravel. And then silence, and then the ordinary sounds of Wetherbourne settling into the night around him. He stood in the library for a long time. He had thought, in the first days after she left, that the castle felt empty. He had been right, but the emptiness he was living in now was a different kind, not the empty of something taken, but the empty of a space being carefully cleared, something being prepared for. He did not know yet what Eleanor would decide. He was not going to let himself behave as though he did. She had come for Christmas, and she had stayed late in the library, and she had told him that he was paying attention, and that it mattered. And those were not small things, but they were not the end of the story either. She was in London in a house she was rebuilding room by room, learning the shape of a life that was entirely her own. That was not nothing. He was beginning to understand. Something she had needed for a very long time, and something he had not, until now, been willing to see the necessity of. He found Eleanor's notebook the next morning, the one he had heard about, but not yet found. The small, leather-bound book that turned out to be tucked into the drawer of her writing desk in the small north-facing room. He had not looked for it deliberately. He had gone in to find a piece of correspondence he needed. And the drawer had been left slightly open, and there it was. He picked it up. He opened it to the first page. It was not a diary. It was not a love letter or a catalogue of grievances. It was exactly what it had been described to him as being: lists, notes, plans, a record of the actual work of Wetherbourne, written in Eleanor's small, precise hand, with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of someone who knew that if she didn't write it down, it would exist nowhere but in her memory. He turned the pages. The Birch family, the Maitland boy, with a note about James's school attendance that went back 18 months. The church roof with contractor names and cost comparisons. The agricultural analysis with margin notes on sources and a calculation of the projected yield improvement if the recommendations were adopted. Dozens of entries, dozens of small and large interventions. Dozens of lives that were running a little more smoothly because Eleanor Wycliffe had noticed them and done something about it. On the last written page, near the bottom, a single line that was different from the rest, not a list. Not a note, not a plan, just a sentence, written in a slightly less controlled hand than the rest, as though it had been written quickly and then not revisited. I wonder sometimes whether anyone would notice if I simply stopped." He stood in the small north-facing room and held the notebook and understood, with a completeness that had not been available to him before this moment, that the question in that sentence was the question she had been living with for years. Not whether the work would stop, of course someone would notice the work, but whether she would, whether the person doing it, beneath all the usefulness and competence and quiet management of everything, was visible to anyone at all. He had not noticed. He had walked past this room every day for 4 years and never once opened the door. He closed the notebook carefully. He set it back in the drawer. He sat for a moment in the small chair with the faded green cushion and felt the full weight of what he had failed to see, pressing down without drama or mercy, and let it. Then he stood up. He straightened his jacket. He went back to his desk. There was work to do. Not the work of managing an estate, though there was that too, but the other work. The slower and less comfortable kind. The work of becoming someone who deserved to have his wife come home. He was not there yet, he knew that. But for the first time since she had left, the distance between here and there felt like something he was actually crossing. One careful, honest step at a time. The Agricultural Society dinner was held on the 20th of January, in the Assembly Rooms in York. Charles had attended this dinner every year since inheriting the title. He knew the room, knew the men in it, knew the particular atmosphere of an all-male gathering, in which the business of land and politics and mutual congratulation was conducted with the comfortable certainty of people who had never been required to question whether the arrangement was fair. He had been one of those people. He had sat at these tables and accepted the handshakes and the compliments and the quiet assumption that the world was correctly ordered, and he had never thought to examine any of it. He thought about it now, sitting at the head table between Lord Harmont and old Sir Reginald Ashworth, waiting for the right moment in the evening's program. Ashford had confirmed the timing after the reading of the year's correspondence and before the presentation of the Society's commendations. A gap in the program that Charles had requested specifically, and which Ashford had arranged with the tight-lipped efficiency of a man fulfilling an obligation he privately considers unwise. Harmont leaned toward him at one point during the soup course. "Heard you've been making changes at Wetherbourne. Visiting tenants yourself. Reviewing the informal assistance arrangements." Said informal assistance with the faint bewilderment of a man encountering a concept he has never previously considered relevant to his life. "Unusual approach, overdue approach," Charles said. Harmont looked at him. Then he returned to his soup. Ashworth, on his other side, said nothing, but Charles caught the old man watching him with an expression that was not disapproving. Sir Reginald had known his father and his grandfather, and had attended this dinner for 40 years, and had the specific quality of very old men who have stopped being surprised by things and started simply watching to see what happens next. When Ashford called for the room's attention after the correspondence reading, Charles rose. The room settled. 40 men, most of whom had known him for years, looking up from their port and their conversation with the expectation of routine commendations and the usual brief remarks from the senior members present. "Gentlemen," Charles said, and the room was quiet. "I wish to correct an error." He had rehearsed this. He had written it out and crossed it out and written it again, until he found the version that was direct without being a performance of directness. What he said, standing at that table in front of 40 of his peers, was this: that the Eastern Parcel Analysis submitted to the Society in the spring of the previous year, under the name of the Duke of Wetherbourne, had not been written by the Duke of Wetherbourne. It had been researched and written entirely by his wife, Eleanor Wycliffe, Duchess of Wetherbourne, who had been unable to submit it under her own name because the Society's membership rules did not permit it. He said that the analysis was, in his assessment, and in the assessment of the men who had benefited from implementing its recommendations, work of exceptional quality. He said that the Society's rules on this matter were ones he intended to formally challenge at the next membership meeting. And he said that he was correcting the record tonight, publicly and without equivocation, because the alternative, continuing to hold credit for work that was not his, was not something he was prepared to do. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which 40 men are simultaneously deciding what to think. Then Sir Reginald Ashworth, 73 years old, and the longest-serving member of the Yorkshire Agricultural Society, put down his port glass and began to applaud. It was not enthusiastic applause. It was the measured, deliberate applause of a man who has decided something and is making his position clear. But it was applause, and in a room like that room, from a man like that man, it was enough. 3 others joined. Then 5. By the time Charles sat back down, perhaps half the room was clapping, with the other half maintaining the careful silence of men who are not yet certain of their position. Harmont said nothing at all. Ashworth leaned across the table. "Your father," the old man said, "would have been appalled." Charles met his eyes. "I am not your father," he said. Ashworth looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his port again. "No," he said, with something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "You're not." Charles did not tell Eleanor about the dinner before it happened. He had been resolute on that point through the weeks of preparation, and he remained resolute afterward. He did not write to her that evening. He did not send a messenger to the Belgrave house. He went back to Wetherbourne, sat in his study, and let the evening be what it was, not a gesture aimed at Eleanor, but a correction aimed at himself. Its value was not in her response to it. Its value was that it was right, and he had done it. And 40 men in York now knew the truth of something that had been false for nearly a year. He wrote to her 4 days later in his regular weekly letter, and mentioned the dinner in 2 sentences, that he had attended, that he had addressed the membership on the subject of the Eastern Parcel submission, and that she would likely hear about it from various quarters, and that he wanted her to hear his account first. Her response came 6 days after that. He opened it at his desk. In the early morning, before Hargreaves had brought the tea. "Charles," Lady Harmont wrote to me. She heard about the dinner from her husband, who apparently returned home in a state of considerable agitation. Her letter it contained a great many words that added up to the information that you had said what you said, and that the room had been divided on the matter, and that Sir Reginald Ashworth had been the first to applaud. I read her letter 3 times. Then I sat for a very long time. I am not going to tell you what to make of that. You will make of it what you will. But I want you to know something, and I have been sitting with whether to write it for 4 of the 6 days since her letter arrived. And I have decided that I am going to write it because I am done with the habit of not saying things. In 6 years of marriage, I gave you everything I knew how to give. I gave you my intelligence and my time and my attention and my loyalty. And I gave all of it without conditions, and for a long time I told myself that was strength. I understand now that it was partly strength and partly the fear of asking for something and being told I was asking for too much. You are not making me afraid of that anymore. I will come to Wetherbourne at the end of February. Eleanor, he set the letter down on the desk. He sat for a moment without moving. Then he went to find Thomas. His son was at breakfast, operating with the systematic focus he brought to any task he considered important, which this morning was the construction of a small fortress from bread rolls before Mrs. Calloway could intervene. Charles sat across from him and watched this enterprise for a moment. "Your mother is coming at the end of February," Charles said. Thomas looked up. The fortress was temporarily abandoned. "Is she staying? I don't know yet." He held his son's gaze. "But she is coming." Thomas considered this with the careful patience that he apparently came by through Eleanor, and which Charles was only now beginning to recognize as a quality he deeply respected in both of them. "Are you going to make her want to stay?" "I am going to try," Charles said. "That is all I can do." Thomas picked up a bread roll, weighed it in his hand, and set it back down. Wellington was in the kitchen garden again this morning. Mrs. Tyndall was very displeased. I imagine she was. But she didn't actually do anything about it. The boy looked at him with those dark, careful eyes. "I think she's fond of him. She just doesn't want anyone to know." Charles looked at his son and thought, Eleanor has raised this child alone in practical terms for the past several years, and has made him into a person who notices things and says them with precision and finds room for kindness, even in the assessment of a cook's secret attachment to a fox. That was not something that happened by accident. That was love, applied daily with consistency and attention, and the full force of a woman's intelligence. "Thomas," he said, "when your mother comes, I want you to tell her about Mrs. Tyndall and the fox." "Exactly as you just told me," the boy nodded seriously, as though receiving a mission of considerable importance. "I will." February moved slowly. Charles used it. He did the things he had been doing: the tenant visits, the household attention, the careful reconstruction of the support systems. Eleanor had been running invisibly, but he did them now with more fluency, more naturally, as though the practice of the previous months had worn a groove in something that had previously been unyielding. He still found things he hadn't known about, still had conversations with tenants or staff that revealed gaps in his understanding of his own estate. Each time he wrote it down. Each time he added it to the 14 pages that had become 30. A working document of Wetherbourne as it actually existed, rather than as it appeared in the official records. In the second week of February, he received an unexpected visitor. Lady Beatrice Langley arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a calling card and the air of a woman who is accustomed to being received. She was a widow, had been for 3 years, and had been a friend of the Wycliffe family since before Charles had inherited the title. He had not seen her since the previous spring before Eleanor left. He received her in the drawing room with the wariness of a man who is uncertain of the agenda. Beatrice Langley was 34 years old and entirely aware of every implication of a single woman calling on a man in a marital situation such as his. She addressed the implication immediately, which was either very forthright or very strategic, and Charles was not yet certain which. "I am not here in any capacity that requires you to be concerned," she said, settling into the chair across from him with the ease of a woman who does not trouble herself with the kind of anxiety that makes people sit on the edges of furniture. "I am here because I was in Yorkshire visiting my sister, and because Eleanor wrote to me last month, and because I have known you both long enough to feel entitled to say something that probably needs saying." "Then say it," Charles said. "Eleanor is going to come back." Beatrice met his eyes without flinching. "Not because of the dinner, though that mattered. And you should know it mattered considerably more than she is likely to tell you directly. She is going to come back because she loves you, and because she can see that you are changing, and because Eleanor Wycliffe is not a woman who gives up on something she has invested herself in without very good reason." A pause. "She had very good reasons to give up. She chose not to. I want you to understand the magnitude of that." Charles held her gaze. "I am beginning to." "Good." Beatrice did not look away. "Because the version of you that she is returning to has to be real. Your Grace, not a performance. Not a month of attentiveness followed by a gradual drift back to the comfortable patterns. She has been paying attention her entire life. She will know the difference between genuine change and a man who has learned to do a better impression of himself." "I know that." "Then prove it every day," Beatrice said simply. Not with dramatic gestures. With the small things. The things she mentioned and you remembered. The questions you ask before she has to tell you. The moments when you notice she is tired and you say something instead of waiting for her to say it first. She picked up her teacup. "A castle is not kept standing by its tallest tower. Your Grace. It survives because every stone carries its weight." He looked at her. "Eleanor didn't write that." "No," Beatrice agreed. "That one is mine." She drank her tea with the satisfaction of someone who has said what they came to say. But she would agree with it. Beatrice stayed for an hour. She told him several things about Eleanor's life in London that Eleanor had not told him, not as betrayal. He understood, but as information he needed. Eleanor had been attending lectures. She had been to the theater 4 times and had opinions about all of it. She had met a woman named Dr. Frances Garrett who was involved in the movement to reform married women's property rights, and had found the conversation so stimulating that she had attended 3 subsequent meetings of the group. "She is not suffering in London," Beatrice said as she prepared to leave. "I want you to understand that too. She is discovering things about herself that she did not have the space to discover at Wetherbourne. When she comes back, if she comes back to stay, she will bring those things with her. They are not threats to your household. They are part of who she is." "I know," Charles said. "I want that. I want all of her, not the version that fit what I was willing to accommodate." Beatrice studied him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think you actually mean that now." She left. Charles stood in the entrance hall after her carriage had gone and thought about what it meant that a woman who barely knew him had come to make sure he understood what he was being given the chance at. Eleanor had people who loved her, people who had noticed what he had failed to notice for 4 years, people who were watching to see whether he was worth the risk she was taking. He went back to his desk and wrote her a letter that evening, not about the estate, not about Thomas and Wellington, but about the lecture on agricultural methods she had mentioned attending. He had found the speaker's published paper. He had read it. He had 3 questions about the methodology in the second section that he thought she would find interesting, and he asked them. Her response arrived 5 days before she did, and it was 4 pages long, and it was the most animated writing she had produced in any of the letters they had exchanged over the previous 3 months. She had opinions about the methodology. She had counter-arguments. She had a source he had not found that directly addressed the second question and complicated the third. She had written in the margins of her own letter and then apologized for the illegibility of the marginalia in a parenthetical that was, unmistakably, the trace of a woman who had been enjoying herself. He read those 4 pages 3 times. He read them the way he had read her letters from Belgrave Square in the early weeks, with the searching attention of a man trying to understand something, but this time what he was trying to understand was not the shape of his failure. He was trying to understand her, the actual texture of how her mind worked. What interested her, where her thinking went when it was not constrained by the necessity of managing someone else's household. She was extraordinary. He had known this in an abstract way for 6 years. He was only now beginning to know it specifically. She arrived on the 28th of February, on a Friday, at 3:30. Thomas was at his lessons and could not be interrupted. Eleanor had been firm on this in her last letter. She did not want Thomas's education disrupted for arrivals, and so Charles met her alone in the entrance hall. Which felt right. They had begun this in some sense. In this hall. He had stood here and failed to see her absence. He could stand here now and let himself fully see her presence. She came through the door and stopped when she saw him. He had not arranged anything, no flowers, no staff assembled, no attempt to make the moment ceremonial, just the hall, and the fire burning in the grate, and him. She looked well. She looked different from when she had left, in a way he could not immediately locate. And then he found it. She was standing differently. Not with greater formality, but with something less provisional about her, less of the quality of a woman arranging herself to take up the correct amount of space. More of a woman simply occupying space because it was hers to occupy. Eleanor. He moved toward her, and this time he did not stop himself. He took both of her hands and held them, not pulling her closer, simply holding them. Her hands were cold from the journey. She did not pull away, Charles. She looked up at him. Something in her expression was both guarded and open, the face of a person who has made a decision and is in the process of trusting it. Thomas is at his lessons, he said. He will be furious about it. Good, she said. Lessons matter. They went to the library. They sat where they had sat in December. And the fire was the same, and the clock was the same. And the room was the same, but they were not quite the same, and the not quite sameness was not loss but something else. Something that felt more like the first careful steps on ground that has been repaired and not yet fully tested. She told him about London, the lectures, the women she had met, Dr. Garrett and the property reform meetings, the Belgrave house, now fully replastered and fitted and let to a young couple with a particular stipulation in the lease that Eleanor had negotiated it herself, that the garden be maintained, because the previous tenants had let it go and she refused to see it go again. You let it, Charles said. I let it for 6 months initially, she said. It is my house. My parents left it to me. I did not decide what to do with it at anyone else's pace. A beat. But yes, I let it, and you are here, he said carefully. She met his eyes. I am here. He had rehearsed nothing for this moment. He had deliberately not rehearsed it, because the version of himself that Eleanor was coming back to had to be real. And real things were not scripted. He simply said what was true. Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that the asking is not a condition. Whatever your answer is, it will not change what I have been doing or what I intend to do going forward. He held her gaze. Will you forgive me? The question sat between them. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, not the quiet of uncertainty, but the quiet of a woman who has thought about this question in many forms over many months and knows her answer and is deciding how to give it. "I already did," she said, "a long time ago actually. Forgiving you was never the difficult part." Her voice was level and warm, and entirely without drama. The difficult part was deciding whether forgiveness was enough of a reason to come back. "And is it?" "No," she said. And then, "But it is not forgiveness that is bringing me back. It is the man I have been corresponding with for 4 months. The man who read a paper on agricultural methodology and asked me 4 pages of questions about it." She looked at him steadily. "The man who stood up at a dinner in York and told 40 of his peers that the work was mine." He was very still. "Forgiveness is not forgetting," Eleanor said. "It is not returning to what was before. As though nothing happened, as though I was not invisible for 4 years in my own home. It is choosing to build differently." She paused. "I am choosing that. I am here to build differently if you are." "I am," he said. And the thing was, she believed him. He could see it, not the tentative, hoping to believe of the earlier months, but something more grounded. She had been watching him for 4 months through letters and visits and the accounts of Lady Harmont and Beatrice Langley and Mrs. Birch, and she had assembled the evidence with the same precision she brought to everything. And she had come to Wetherbourne on a February afternoon because the evidence was sufficient. She reached into the small bag she carried and set something on the table between them. The wedding ring. He looked at it, the gold band on the polished wood of the library table, where she had placed it with the same care she had placed it on the velvet square on her vanity 4 months ago. "I am not putting it back on today," she said. "I want to be honest about that. I am not ready till I need time to find out what this is. Now that we are starting from somewhere real." She looked at him. "But I am leaving it here, at Wetherbourne, with you." He looked at the ring. Then at her. "That is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." Thomas came thundering down the stairs at 4:30. His lesson having ended slightly early at the insistence of a tutor who was, it appeared, not entirely unmoved by the knowledge that the Duchess had returned. He appeared in the library doorway with the barely contained velocity of a 5-year-old who has been practicing walking instead of running, and is at the absolute limit of his commitment to the exercise. Eleanor opened her arms. Thomas crossed the room in approximately 1.5 seconds. Charles watched his wife hold his son and felt the kind of feeling that does not have a convenient name, something in the territory between grief and gratitude, between the awareness of what had nearly been lost and the particular quality of what was being held. Over Thomas's head, Eleanor looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there 4 months ago. In the doorway of the castle, on the evening she arrived, and found him standing alone in the entrance hall, without ceremony or arrangement. It was not yet trust, fully restored. It was the beginning of trust, chosen deliberately by a woman who understood exactly what she was choosing, and had chosen it anyway. Thomas pulled back and looked at his mother with the focused urgency of the important news he had been holding for her arrival. Wellington was in the kitchen garden again, and Mrs. Tyndall pretended to be angry, but she wasn't. Father noticed too. Eleanor looked at Charles over their son's head with the ghost of a smile, warm, private, the specific smile of someone recognizing something they had hoped to find and found. "Of course she wasn't," Eleanor said. "Everyone who lives in this house eventually loves the things that aren't supposed to belong here." Charles held her gaze. He did not look away. Some things need no answer. Some things are the answer. Wetherbourne Castle had stood for 200 years on Yorkshire stone, and Wycliffe pride and the careful management of men who believed that providing was the same as loving. It had been a great house in the way that great houses are measured by acreage, by income, by the weight of its name in the rooms where names carry weight. But the woman standing in its library, with her son's arms around her waist and her wedding ring on the table between her and her husband, had always known what the house needed that it had not been getting. Not management, not ceremony, not a duke at its head and a duchess at its margins. A home is not kept by the tallest stone. It is kept by every person within it being seen, being valued, being given enough room to be exactly who they are. Eleanor Wycliffe had left Wetherbourne with her dignity intact. She had returned with something more than that. She had returned knowing her own worth, not as a function of the title she carried, or the house she managed, or the husband she had stood behind, but as a woman who had finally, without apology, required the world to see her clearly. And this time, the man who stood across from her looked back with his whole face open and saw everything. That was not the ending. That was the beginning of the only marriage worth keeping, the one built not on assumption, but on attention, not on position, but on presence, not on what a duke provides, but on what a husband finally learns to give.